Welcome to the Pacific Research Institute's Next Round podcast. I'm Rowena Itchon, COO, and with me, as always, is Tim Anaya, Vice President of Marketing and Communications. So we're taping this the following day after the DeSantis-Newsom face-off on the Sean Hannity show, the blue state versus red state. So, Tim, what did you think? What were your initial impressions?
Well, I think the people who tuned in to Thursday Night Football watched a hell of a game between the Cowboys and the Seahawks, and they were the real winners of Thursday night. Everyone else who tuned in to the Newsom-DeSantis debate probably got a headache. I think the idea of it, right, that we have leading liberal and conservative leaders debate public policy issues, I think that's great. There should be more of that, right? That would be refreshing to watch. That's not really what we had. You got two people who have records of accomplishment that they wanted to talk about, basically talking over one another, throwing out their rehearsed sound bites. You're not telling the truth. No, you're not telling the truth. I think probably the most interesting thing of it is America has seen Ron DeSantis because he's been running for president and he's been a pretty high profile person in the national media. I don't know that everyone has seen Gavin Newsom and seen Gavin Newsom's performances up close in person. What he did on the stage, I've seen 1,000 times before. And I think if you were a liberal activist, then you probably thought Gavin Newsom was the cat's meow and had some great one-liners and zingers. If you're a conservative and you watched that, you probably thought that Ron DeSantis was great and really took it to Gavin Newsom. Who won? I don't know. Probably the people who weren't watching, as I said earlier, were probably the winners. Will it change anything in the campaign? I don't know. Certainly, Newsom brought up some points that DeSantis's opponents could exploit on the campaign trail. But I think Newsom presented himself well, had some good lines, had some memorable lines. The one about, neither one of us are going to be our party's presidential nominees. That was a pretty damning line. DeSantis had some good lines. The bit about Newsom would say something and then Fox had the facts on the screen and he would say that's a lie. Well, no, it's not. That's not part of his narrative. Facts are inconvenient things, as someone once said. So, I think each side's supporters probably thought their man won. Will it change anything? Probably not much. What did you think of the debate?
Well, I thought this was DeSantis's to lose, because if you look at the economic measures side by side, Florida crushes California. And if DeSantis couldn't win this debate, then he's not ready for prime time. He needs to wait another 4 years, and he probably will have to anyway. He needs to wait another 4 years for the next presidential election. But in my opinion, I think he did win this debate, and I thought he won handily. The problem for him and the other GOP candidates is that if the polls are to be believed, of course, Trump is so far along, and the only thing that's really going to affect the race at this point is going to be determined by Trump and not what any of the candidates do, not even if DeSantis had won this hands down. And I think he probably had the edge. So you're right. I don't think this is going to change anything. Again, I think this was his to lose. And if he had not done as well as he did, it would have been a problem. So he's, depending on what happens to Trump, you've got DeSantis, you've got Haley waiting in the wings, but that's all they can really do is just wait in the wings. And we're both former speechwriters, and we're humble enough to know that a picture is worth 1,000 words. And I have to agree with you on what you said earlier, is that a lot of people don't know Newsom, or especially out in the country. And when you have DeSantis and Newsom side by side, juxtaposed with one another, debating points, I have to say that Newsom looked a little goofy. I kept thinking of the line, "I'm not really a governor, but I play one on TV." He didn't look like a serious candidate. He looked a little wild-eyed and overly exaggerated his gestures. And I think that DeSantis had a little bit more gravitas, because clearly he's been, more practiced at this, given he's done these debates quite a bit the past 6 months. So I would say for people out there in the country who have never seen Newsom before out in the Midwest, I think next to DeSantis, he didn't look all that presidential to me.
Well, and it makes you wonder too, kind of the strategy of this. Well, DeSantis's audience was obvious, right? It's Iowa, New Hampshire, South Carolina. Well, who was Newsom playing for last night? And I think it probably was the audience of the White House. That little silly line about, people confused how to say the vice president's name. Okay, I'm sure she's dealt with that her entire life. It's not a racist remark that he bungled her name. Stuff like that was just over the top, but that's not something you would normally say unless your audience really was the White House. I wonder if the LBJ moment unexpectedly happens next year or in 2028. How did Newsom handle himself with that national liberal audience? I think there were some things that they would cheer, that taken it to him. He certainly, agree with him or not, he has a heck of a lot more fight in him and takes to the Republicans the fight than Joe Biden does. That's not saying much, but you would think on paper, Gavin Newsom is kind of the real life Jed Bartlett, what a liberal's dream candidate. And so I wonder, those people looking at it through that lens, were they impressed by what they saw? And probably there were moments that they liked. Now we'll see going forward. Will Gavin Newsom be in play as a surrogate on the campaign trail after this performance? But at the end of the day, that's what I wondered most of all watching Gavin Newsom. It's impressive to see him speak to a Fox audience. It's impressive to see him go to what was really kind of a 2-on-1 affair, despite what Sean Hannity said. But what was really Newsom's goal in doing this? Who was his audience with that debate? I don't know, Ro, what do you think?
Well, I have to agree with you there. I think we're thinking along the same lines. If I were a progressive, a liberal, and I was a supporter of abortion or a supporter of identity and gender politics, well, I think Newsom made a pretty passionate case for Americans with that perspective. I thought that's where he felt the most confident and the most passionate and genuine. Certainly that would appeal to a certain group of elites, really. I think in California and the nation, really probably the big money supporters, Hollywood, the environmentalists, and so forth. I think they would really like his performance when it came to those issues. But, on the bread and butter issues, I think he failed. And I don't think that his megawatt smile could gloss over the fact that gas is $6 or $7 in many parts of California and maybe a little less in other parts of the country, but still a tremendous burden to Californians. But yes, I did think that liberals and progressives were probably pretty proud of him last night.
What was he thinking on the facts on the screen? Because I know the facts that Fox showed, those are facts we commonly have referenced, that we write about in our studies and commentaries and op-eds.
And they're government sources, Tim.
Yeah. I mean, every one of those, I don't know about you, but every one of those, when they put those cards up, we've seen all those figures before. We know those are gold standard correct facts. And to just kind of just say, well, no, it's not. No, to say laughably, there was more learning loss in Florida than California. I mean, read any column in recent months by Lance Azumi, that's not true. So I don't know what the thinking was there. Is that a character flaw, or is that someone who just got caught up in the moment and made a mistake?
Or perhaps he just didn't think that anyone would check the facts, and maybe he can get away with that in local speeches around the state, but he can't get away with that at the national level, and he's gotta learn that.
Well, and as you can see, Gavin Newsom is going to be a formidable opponent. If he is the presidential candidate someday, he's going to be a formidable guy to go up against. And that also extends to reporters covering Gavin Newsom. We know the Capitol Press Corps, especially during COVID, had great frustration covering Newsom and getting him to answer questions. Now, they don't push back like Ron DeSantis pushed back, but you can see he's a very hard guy to pin down.
So for this podcast, our guest is Ben Judge, who is a managing director of Monument Valley, a firm focused on adapting academic research for for popular audiences. So Ben Judge edited this fantastic new book on John Quincy Adams. For those of you who you probably remember back in your high school days, John Quincy Adams is the sixth president, but he was also a president known for his establishment of American foreign policy early on in the nation's history. I think it was a very fascinating interview, and we try to apply John Quincy Adams' foreign policy and philosophy to what's happening now in terms of China, Ukraine, Israel, all of the hot spots in the world.
Since we taped this interview, I purchased a copy of his book, and it's a good sale price on Amazon.com. The book is called United and Independent. And if you're a history lover, if you're a lover of that period of history, it's a really, really good book. And John Quincy Adams certainly is a fascinating character in the early years of our country. So if you're into any of that kind of early American history, this episode and this book is for you.
Thanks very much for listening. And here's Ben Judge. Welcome to PRI's Next Round podcast, Ben.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
So let's start with why John Quincy Adams? What piqued your interest in choosing him for your research? And in broad terms, tell us about the book.
Yeah, so Adams is this fascinating person in American history. I mean, he's one of the great foreign policy thinkers. You don't see, throughout American history, you don't see many people like him who are as involved in American foreign affairs, but who also write about it as much as he did. He's prolific. He kept a diary from when he was a teenager through the end of his life, all of which we have. He wrote countless letters. And in part because he is so prolific, and this gets to the question about why the book, it's very hard to study him. You have a lot of books out there that are about John Quincy Adams and about his thought, but to actually study him, study his thinking about America's place in the world, about how to think about foreign nations, that's actually pretty difficult because of the just sheer volume. And so the idea with the book was there should be a one volume accessible work that lets you really study John Quincy Adams. And so that means, compiling the right material, but also giving some context to the times where he was in his life. And that's what the book tries to do.
So you consider John Quincy Adams the father of early American foreign policy. So for folks thinking back to high school history class, remembering John Quincy Adams' great contributions, give us a short biography of our sixth president and maybe share some of his contributions to foreign policy in the early history of the U.S.
Yeah. So he was born in 1767. So the early part of his life is really the early part of the nation. Obviously his father played a prominent role in everything, America, 17th or 18th century. But there's a great historian by the name of Samuel Flagg Bemis, great diplomatic historian, won a Pulitzer for his biography of John Quincy Adams, who says that John Quincy Adams had two great careers separated by President of the United States. His 4 years as president are probably the least consequential time. Or the least consequential times of his public life. So that first part of his career, the first one that Bemis is referring to, is really foreign affairs. In that time, he is ambassador to the Netherlands, to Prussia. He's a United States senator. He's an ambassador to Russia. He's peace commissioner post-war of 1812. He's ambassador to England, and then he spends 8 years as Secretary of State. So all of that is kind of career number one. Then he's president. And then career number two is he's in the House of Representatives, and he proves to be one of the great anti-slavery advocates of the times. And probably what distinguishes him the most in that time is his particular fixation on the use of government power to stop the debate over slavery. And he's in the United States Congress from 1831 through his death in 1848. And So that's really his career. He's for that first part, I think the thing that people will talk about the most, which is also correct to focus on it, is the Monroe Doctrine. His impact on the Monroe Doctrine, kind of crafting the thought behind it, and then ultimately getting that to a point where it became the policy of the United States that we considered interferences by European powers on the North American and South American continent to be a problem for us has really lasted a long time, and it's informed a lot of American foreign policy ever since.
Ben, in your book, you talk about the Adams Triangle and deciding whether to deploy military force. Tell us about that.
Yeah, so this was what did I learn from Adams' development? This was, I've now spent some time with Adams. What does a student of Adams, or at least one student, come away thinking about when you read his thought over the course of all of these years? And that's what led to this idea of the Adams Triangle. And it's that there are, in terms of when to employ U.S. military force, there are three considerations that Adams always comes back to. The one at the top is national, and I say profit very deliberately. That is, not as an economic term, but as the definition of gain minus law. Every war, every intervention has a cost. Could be financial, could be in terms of people, could be in terms of just placing a free society on a war footing. It's going to have a cost. Now, the question is it worth it? And the way you determine whether or not it's worth it, gain side, is does the engagement make us more united, more independent than if we weren't to engage. Union and independence, it's the reason for the title of the book, are the two characteristics that Adams will always come back to. So that's piece number one of the triangle. Piece number two is capability. Are we capable of achieving a win? That matters. And Adams, throughout different points in his career, talks about situations where there is a positive national profit for getting engaged, but maybe we don't have the capability. We have to address that situation. Then finally, the third piece of the triangle is public sentiment. Adams will always come back to this, that without the people's support for an engagement, you are risking, you're not just risking as a practical matter, the perpetuation of an engagement, you're actually risking union itself. So those are the three components of the triangle. It's the idea of national profit, capability, and public sentiment.
So now that we know what the Adams Triangle is, could you give us a few examples of it during Adams's tenure as both as a diplomat and as a statesman?
Yeah. So the one that comes to mind, immediately is in 1818. And just by way of saying, there are a number of examples throughout his career where he is in some way advocating for restraint or for a diplomatic solution. Sometimes that's simply to buy time. Sometimes that's because he doesn't think that the national profit is actually positive. But, in 1818, there's a situation where Seminole Indians invade Florida, probably with the backing of the British, or they think at the time probably come back. With the backing of the British. We now know they absolutely was with the backing of the British. Andrew Jackson goes into Spanish Florida, sovereign territory, to actually chase down the Indians that have been raiding villages along the border. A lot of people in the United States say that that's not okay, and want Jackson to be relieved of his command. Adams defends Jackson, defends him holding territory in another country because that country is incapable of governing its affairs in a way that protects the safety of American citizens. And why does he say that? Because we are not able to be independent, to govern our own affairs while these acts are occurring. He knows he has to convince the public, so he goes on a PR tour. It involves him even leaking certain documents to the press. But it all comes back to this idea of there is a threat to the American people across a border that has to be dealt with in order for the American people to stay free and able to govern their own affairs, and specifically the American people. It's not just the idea of America in the abstract. They're Americans that are going to have their homes raided if this isn't addressed. Probably the one most applicable to today.
So, Ben, let's fast forward to today. Let's apply the Adams Triangle test to America's adversaries. So, how about starting with China? What if China attempts to take over Taiwan? What would the Adams Triangle conclude?
Yeah, so we'll start with the two, minor parts of the triangle almost. Public sentiment in the last 8 years has changed dramatically when it comes to China. I mean, I think it's not to overstate things, there's now a general consensus that China is not our friend, which, pre 2016 wasn't what people were saying, but it is now. So public sentiment would, I think, largely be positive. Capability, like that one's tough. Depending on who you speak to, that's just. I mean, I think capability is a plus for us, but that's pretty even, especially as close as Taiwan is to Chinese mainland and their own defenses. But again, I think largely speaking, the capability is either 50-50 or slightly favors us. And then, but the one that matters most is, this idea of national profit. And you've heard some of this come up in the presidential debates. Like a lot of our modern way of life is predicated on the manufacturing base in Taiwan. That is a pure statement of fact. So do we become less independent if the supermajority of semiconductors that are coming into the United States are firmly are made out of a country that is firmly under Chinese rule? Well, I'd say that's a yes. Do we become less independent? Yeah, we sure do. I think that's where we'd net out. The one thing I would say, and it's always the part that Adams talks about. It's the part everyone looks, past or doesn't give enough attention to. Prolonged wars have a way at challenging union. We become less united as a people the longer military engagements tend to go. And so even when national profit is positive, you still have to keep that in mind.
So, of course, we're providing arms to Ukraine's war with Russia and Israel's goals to secure its residents from terror groups like Hamas. We're seeing that political parties in the United States are, divided even within their own constituents. So, what would the Adams Triangle say about these current foreign policy contentions?
Yeah, so the first thing it would say is you have to think about the triangle. I think, especially with Ukraine, there's been this tendency to fund and ask questions later. And, I think if someone learns anything from reading Adams, you realize that's a bad idea. And it's not simply a bad idea because in practical terms, you don't exactly know why you're doing something, or the strategic interests of different actions or the strategic implications of different actions. It's because you owe it to the American people to explain why it is you're getting involved. So I think the first thing you'd say with the Adams Triangle as it relates to both of those is that public sentiment matters. And you have to take it seriously. It would also say that you can't combine engagements. Yes, there are principles that transcend a particular place and a particular time and a particular engagement. But every time we get involved in a foreign matter, it has to be viewed on its own terms. So the idea that somehow you can look at Ukraine and Israel together just wouldn't pan out in this. And you might be in favor, plenty of people are in favor of both. Plenty of people are in favor of us being involved in neither. But you cannot combine the debate over those two and expect a lasting, solid outcome.
So Ben, you're a political scientist, a historian, and a former naval officer. What would you advise President Biden given the current state of foreign policy? And what about the next president?
I think there's a tendency to think that the question, what's in it for us, is callous, is insensitive. My advice to current president, next president, any president, is that the question of what's in it for us is a moral question. If you're leading a free people, then that question is always, because you're not asking what's in it for us simply in a way of saying, do we benefit economically? Do we benefit, does our industrial base benefit? It's, do we benefit as a free people? Do we stay free? Are we able to govern our own affairs? Are we able to stay united? That's what's in it for us. And the more you keep that question top of mind, the more, I would say, the more rational the foreign policy will be, but also the more stable.
So finally, as we close, we call our podcast Next Round because we love to talk about public policy over a great glass of California wine. And we always like to ask our guests for their recommendation. So what are you drinking? What cocktail, wine, beer, or other beverage are you enjoying these days to celebrate your great new book and the coming holidays?
I'm going to give you something that I learned about recently. Full disclosure, I have not had the courage to make it and drink it, but I now live in Michigan, and the official drink of Detroit, wouldn't know it because most bartenders don't know about it, won't make it for you, but for good reason. They probably won't make it. It's called the Bolsha, and it is vodka, Worcestershire sauce, Tabasco, and beef bouillon. And it was created in the 50s by the ADME that was handling Campbell's beef bouillon. They came up with the idea of a drink to move Campbell's beef bouillon, and that became the drink of Detroit. So maybe one of you guys will have more courage than I will to put that drink together and actually make it, or I'm just gonna try to get someone to lose a bet and try it on my behalf.
Ben, I've got a lot of cousins who grew up in Detroit, so I'm going to ask them if they've heard of it and whether I should drink it. So I'm sure they'll say, absolutely, Rowena. Thanks so much. And please check out and buy Ben Judge's book on John Quincy Adams on Amazon.com and your other booksellers. Thanks again, Ben. If you like this episode, please tell your friends and subscribe to PRI's podcast at iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, TuneIn, iHeartRadio, and Spotify. And when you're on these platforms, don't forget to give us a big 5 stars. If you don't subscribe to any of these, you can still listen on PRI's YouTube page, youtube.com/Pacific Research 1. That's the number 1. Thanks for listening. I'm Rowena Itchon. Hope you'll come back again for Next Round with PRI.